Good evening from the Gail Lemron Auditorium in the Captain Willie Miller Building on the campus of Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. Welcome to the President Speaker Series. On behalf of Dr. John Johnson, the president of Embry-Riddle, my name is Mark Bernier. I'm the moderator for tonight's event. For the first time, we're bringing back someone to the President Speaker Series for a report card on the district, the state of Florida, and the nation. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great privilege and pleasure to introduce our guest for tonight in the town hall setting, Congressman Ron DeSantis. Thanks for coming, Congressman.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's a full day for you. You've been all over the place. For people who don't know, your day started when?
Yeah, well, probably about, probably 6 a.m. when I was packing and getting ready for everything I needed to do. But then we left my house at probably 8, got down to DeLand High School, spoke with them, had 3 or 4 stops before then. When you told people to silence their cell phones, it occurred to me I didn't have to do that because my cell phone's dead, no battery after today. So,
anyway, well, we're glad that you're concluding your day with us. I know everyone is interested to get your take on the current situation that involves Ukraine, the Crimean election, where they've elected to go to Russia. Your thoughts on the president's response first, and then Vladimir Putin's response.
Well, this referendum is obviously a farce, but it is true that there are people in Crimea who consider themselves more Russian than Ukrainian. So it's a delicate issue in that sense. Clearly, I think Vladimir Putin feels emboldened to basically use his power on the world stage. I think that this began long ago, but most recently we saw this where he essentially took the lead in Syria in absolving Assad of any type of accountability, and supposedly Assad was going to give up his weapons. We know that was a farce, and so he sees an opportunity here, and he's taking it. And so I think that for the president to do sanctions on 6 or 7 people, you probably were better off doing nothing than doing that. I mean, these guys are going to Twitter now and they're mocking the U.S. response. And so it's not an easy situation at this point. I mean, I think the people in the western part of Ukraine are very much pro-West, pro-America. They don't want anything to do with Putin. But at the same time, I think we've limited our options. But at the end of the day, this just goes with how you're doing foreign policy. If you have a strong defense, if you're projecting strength, and if you're standing by your allies and you're respected by your adversaries, you end up having to deal with these types of situations less frequently. So that's why it's good to maintain a strong defense and to have presidents who, when Reagan got sworn into office, there were still hostages in Iran. Within an hour later, they were on their way home. I think part of the reason for that was because people looked, the Iranians saw that Reagan actually meant what he said, and they feared for what could happen if they cross it. I don't think Vladimir Putin is in a position where he has a lot of respect for U.S. leadership, and I think that's to the detriment of a free world.
Is the Ukraine a write-off for the United States? In other words, what's in it for us to get involved?
Well, our options are definitely limited. I don't know whether, I think philosophically, all those Eastern Bloc countries, most of them have already been integrated with the West, and I think most of the folks, those protesters in Ukraine, wanted the same thing. So we have common cause with those folks, but it's just a type of situation where militarily we don't really have any options to do much. So I don't know if Ukraine as a whole is written off, but I don't see us doing very much to reunify Crimea with Ukraine.
Do you subscribe to any of the theory that's out there now that the Russians will peel off parts of the Ukraine one piece at a time? The word from intelligence seems to be that the next move for the Russians is to go to that heavily populated Russian sector of the Ukraine and peel them off for Russia.
That may be what Putin's going to do. I think there's risk for him in doing that, and the question is, how are we going to respond? How are our allies going to respond? One of the things you look at, Russia basically has power because they have an abundance of energy. And lately we now have an abundance of natural gas with new technologies. So should we put ourselves in a situation where we can supply more liquefied natural gas to our European allies, and that would make them less dependent on Russia, and it would weaken Putin's power. So these are things, realizing that he's playing a long game, we need to start taking steps to fortify our allies and make sure that Russia is not able to project power like they are right now.
Let me stay with defense for just a moment to ask you, we spoke in the last couple of weeks. You're a decorated war veteran yourself. You served your country overseas. What was your reaction when you heard that the United States would reduce its budget in terms of its military defensive prowess? Your thoughts as to, does that put us in as dangerous position as some conservatives say we're in?
It's, the founding fathers, you go back and you read them, they said that the key to national security is to have the best possible state of defense, so that instead of inviting dangers, you're deterring dangers, and you're projecting strength to people so they look at it and they don't want to even mess with you. So that's the goal, is to, with a strong defense. It's not to go get involved in a bunch of wars. It's so you actually can stay out of wars. And so when you move in the other direction and you're skimping on capability, that is going to affect your ability to project power. Now, I've never said the defense budget should be off the table, because if you look at it, we spend hundreds of millions of dollars in defense on green energy and things that have nothing to do with defense. And so I'm absolutely fine with looking at everything. I think we should do a top-to-bottom audit of the Pentagon. But when you're talking about reducing capability in the way that I think Chuck Hagel and the President are suggesting, that is going to come with a cost. And my fear is that ultimately it ends up being more expensive, because if you're inviting more problems, you may have to deal with more things, or have more instances which you have to defend your interest. But here's the thing. Right now, with the most recent budget agreement, the projections for 10 years into the future, 2024, if you include all mandatory spending, Obamacare, Medicaid, entitlements, and interest on the debt, you add all those up, 10 years from now, that's projected to consume 96% of all the tax revenue that the government's taking in. So that means before you've spent anything we appropriate, that's all automatic. Congress doesn't even touch that stuff. So that means everything we actually appropriate, you would have 4% of your tax revenue available for that, and that includes defense, that includes medical research, that includes all the agencies that we have. And the issue is right now we can borrow cheaply, but do you think that that's going to continue for 10 years infinitum with no changes? And I don't think you can assume that that's going to happen. So if you see a major change, even if interest rates go back to normal, that's going to increase the amount of interest you're paying. And then if you had a spike, that would cause the interest to balloon. So you could be in a situation where you're spending all of your money on mandatory programs, entitlements, Obamacare, before you've spent one nickel on defense, and there just may not be anywhere else to go. So I don't think that's where we should go, but we haven't done anything to get us on a long-term, strong fiscal footing.
To stay with that point, the Congressional Budget Office released a report within the last week that showed staggering numbers. By the year 2017, we'll spend more money servicing the debt than we do on Medicare. And by the year 2020, we spend more on servicing the debt than we do on defending the country. That's scary.
And here's where we get in this 2014 election in terms of, what is your view on Obamacare? Do you believe that that is good for the country or not? And even if you can point to benefits, the proposed cost of that when they passed it was $850 billion over 10 years. Now when the CBO looks at it, they say 10-year cost is $2.1 trillion. And so, I've had a lot of people call the office. They've had their plans, the doctors. Some people are having to pay the penalty because they can't afford the plans and they're getting taxed as a result. So there are a lot of bad things, but even if you put all that aside, that's an awful lot of money, and you're not really insuring that many more people. The CBO says that in 10 years from now, you're still going to have 31 million people minimum with no insurance at all. So it seems like we're spending all this money, but not getting a lot of bang for the buck. And so that's why I think, apart from, you can keep your plan, your doctor, the promises that are not true, I think it's going to be fiscally, is this the best investment given the crunch that we're in? I mean, we have one of the highest subscription rates for Medicare Advantage for senior citizens in the country in this district. And Obamacare puts pressure on that, diverts money from Medicare Advantage for Obamacare. Is that something, do you think that that's what you want or not? I don't. I think people like Medicare Advantage, and we need to keep that promise. So that one, because it's such a large amount of money, I think is going to be an important issue, not just in terms of health care, but in terms of the budget.
Is it your estimation that we have violated the law when the president decides to change or move the ball on the implementation of Obamacare in any of its stages? Is that unlawful?
Right. So, I mean, basically, if the law says, hey, President, you can change the deadlines, then you can change the deadlines. I mean, Congress can put waivers in statutes. With Obamacare, these waivers are not there. He's just basically doing it. So you have certain mandates in Obamacare about the insurance plans where they must have it. As we saw last fall, people started having their plans canceled because the plans were illegal under the statute. And obviously that was causing political difficulties. So in the House, I had a bill, Ron Johnson and Marco Rubio had it in the Senate, to say, look, any plan you have, if you want it, someone's willing to offer it to you, you can buy it. The government shouldn't be forcing you out of plans. Well, the president did not want to play ball with us on that. So what he did was he said, well, yeah, this is what the law says, but we're just not going to enforce that. So if you insurance companies, you want to continue offering it, go ahead. So you actually have this situation where if you look up the law, it says one thing, but then kind of wink, wink, nod, nod, we're not going to enforce it. But then you have some insurance commissioners in states like California who say, no, I'm going to enforce the law as written. I'm not going to take your written, your verbal waiver. Florida, I think they've allowed this. So it's really messed up. Some plans in California are illegal under federal law that are not necessarily illegal in some other states. And so the issue is who has lawmaking authority under the Constitution. And clearly, the exclusive ability to make laws is vested in Congress. And so you have the ability, as an executive, when you're enforcing laws, some discretion in terms of how you enforce the law. But you can't just take provisions of law and pretend like they don't exist. And so we've seen this not only with Obamacare, with welfare work requirements, mandatory minimums, so on and so forth. And so it's an issue that strikes to the constitutional separation of powers, which is the most important provision of the Constitution or arrangements in the Constitution to protect freedom. I was at the State of the Union address, and the president, and I have actually a lot of respect for a lot of my Democratic colleagues, so I disagree with on a lot of things, but a lot of them, they have, progressive principles, and they try to apply those. But when he comes to the Congress and says, listen, Congress, here's what you need to do, but if you won't do what I want, then I'm going to do it anyways. And I looked over to my left and saw members of the House cheering that. I'm sorry, that's not something that I respect. I'm not going to cheer any president, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, who comes to Congress and says, their way or the highway, if you won't act, I'm just going to legislate how I want. That's completely contrary to our constitutional order.
You worked on a rule of law that it's a transparency bill. It passed the House. What's in that our audience here at Embry-Riddle and those listening on radio will benefit from?
So it's called the Faithful Execution of the Law Act. And the thing is we're running into the situation where there are waivers, delays, suspensions of law that are being done, but they're not being done in a transparent or honest fashion. For example, recently, and this is something that the reporters had to dig out of one of the Federal Registers, the individual mandate tax, they basically did a stealth delay on that. They buried a footnote in an unrelated regulation and said, if you sign a form saying it's a hardship, then you basically don't have to pay the tax. And this is just madness. So right now, under current law, when an administration decides not to enforce a law because they believe it's unconstitutional, they have to report it to Congress and explain their reasoning. So my bill basically expands that and says, if you're going to suspend a law or delay a law, you need to come to Congress, be transparent, explain how you have the authority, and explain what you're doing. And we got 18 Democrats to join with the Republicans on that, but the president threatened to veto it, and so we'll see what happens. I know Harry Reid's not going to bring it up, but I do think that someone like Mike Lee in the Senate could offer it as an amendment to a related bill. And I actually think it would get 60 votes in the Senate because it's hard to argue. All we're saying is put your cards on the table so we can evaluate this stuff. Because the press, I found, they don't do a very good job in explaining whether somebody has authority to do something. They take it for granted, basically, that the president can do whatever he wants. I don't think that's consistent with the Constitution. And so I think we always have to be asking, where's your authority to do this? And the same with Congress. We need to be asking how we have the authority to do something. And we shouldn't be legislating beyond the powers that we have vested in us under the Constitution either.
If you will, a sidebar to what you were just talking about. Recently, we had a special election. You have a new Republican colleague, David Jolly, 41. I think he's an investment broker. Defeats Alex Sink, who is a Democratic candidate for governor, who lost to Rick Scott. She ran on a platform of amend, not to take it away. Jolly came out with, this is what's wrong with it, and half of the people in the district are upset with it. So to share with this audience, where are you on this? Do we scrap the whole thing? Most people say it's impossible to scrap it, or can it be amended so it can be salvaged and work for somebody?
Well, Howard Dean, the former Vermont governor, Democratic National Committee chairman, he characterized Obamacare as a Rube Goldberg-like contraption. And he supports Obamacare, but he says, look, it's just as complicated. So this idea that somehow you're just going to fix it, I think the problems that we're seeing with people losing coverage, losing their plans, losing access to the doctors, that is basically the law operating as it was intended to operate. And you'll notice when people started getting their plans canceled at first, the response from the White House was, oh, those are junk plans. You don't need those. You're better off with the plans we're going to provide for you. But then you start hearing testimony from individual patients who had plans that they liked and that met their needs, and then so they had to backtrack off of that. And then another thing I would say about this idea that you're going to amend it, not end it, is that's basically a line that's being used. I have not seen one idea or proposal from any of my pro-Obamacare Democratic colleagues to, quote, fix it. They say it, but they have not offered anything in the way of substance. And anytime we try to do things like let people keep their plan, we did an individual mandate delay, they overwhelmingly oppose it. So if you're seeing somebody running on that platform, ask them, okay, well, what are you going to fix? Because I think it's kind of a rhetorical sleight of hand just to try to get through one more election. And with Obamacare, the thing that bugs me about it was, look, you have different points of view on this. I have them over here, fine. But be honest with what you're doing. And there was a lack of honesty with this bill from the very beginning when you're going around saying you're going to keep your plan, period, end of story, mark it down. You like your doctor, you got your doctor. This isn't going to affect you. The fact of the matter is it's affecting an awful lot of people. And it's going to affect tens of millions more when they finally impose this business mandate. The president has delayed that unilaterally now twice. And that is going to have a big effect on employer-provided plans. So when I hear this idea that they're going to amend it, not end it, I don't see any proposals to do so. I think it's just trying to basically say, hey, we're committed to fixing it. But basically what they're trying to do is get some of these senators through this next election, and then they'll start implementing it in pieces, and they're trying to basically spread out the negative effects of it over as many election cycles as possible. But the point I made when I was talking about my bill on the House floor is, okay, you're delaying a lot of this stuff strategically. And this is, in Washington, some of these newspapers there, it'll say, latest Obamacare delay aimed to benefit Democrats in 2014. I mean, these are not conservative sources that are printing that as fact. It's like, oh, it's obvious that that's what they're trying to do. But here's the thing. there's going to be another election after 2014. So what are you going to do? You're going to delay all this stuff now, get yourself through that. Then you're going to delay it try to get Hillary through. I mean, when does it end? And I think the American people should evaluate it and reach a judgment. And so mending it, not ending it is a catchphrase. It sounds great, but there's absolutely no substance behind it that I've seen.
I was trying to think all afternoon, what could I ask him that he hasn't been asked already by people today? And I was thinking, is this issue a cornerstone that's the report card on conservative versus liberal thought? Is it a modern-day report card?
So Obamacare really rests on the idea that if you just delegate all this power to Kathleen Sebelius, the Department of Health and Human Services, let them make a lot of these decisions about health insurance, that basically it'll be good for everybody. And the problem is that there's just a limit to how much you can do in terms of central planning, especially with an industry that's this complicated. It's very complicated. And so that's why all the ideas that Republicans are putting out, what I try to say is, I don't want to just take one bill and replace it. Let's deal with each issue individually. So you deal with access, you deal with competition, you deal with lawsuit abuse, you deal with all these things, rather than say our 2,500-page bill is better than your 2,500-page bill. Part of the problem with it is that it's too big, it's too complicated, and the people in Washington do not have enough expertise to do this. I mean, it should be really, really jarring when, you see what goes on in Silicon Valley, all this stuff, to have over 3 years to just start a website and to not be able to do that in 3 years. That should tell you some of the limits that we're talking about in terms of the competence of central planning. And so I think that it is a time where people are starting to see this. And I do have people come up to me occasionally who will say they're starting to reevaluate. Yeah, I supported this because I thought we needed to do something, but it just went way overboard. We need to take smaller steps.
We're going to come back to domestic policy in just a second. And a reminder to our assembled audience, we have a good audience tonight. Your questions for Congressman DeSantis in just moments. What's on a lot of people's minds, your take on the issue involving the missing plane, the Malaysian flight. I talked with Congressman John Mica, your congressional colleague, earlier today. He said if we had Next Gen in place, we would know where that plane is.
Well, that may be. I'll tell you, in Congress, we have not gotten any inside information at this point about what's going on with that. And so a lot of it is just me listening to people speculate, but I have no idea what happened to it. The terrorist angle in terms of like commandeering that to then deliver a device or something. I understand why they would do that, but it just seemed to me if that was their plan, Israel is on alert even more now as a result of that. It seemed like there would have been other ways that you could get it, but that may actually be what happened. I don't know. It's a very, very strange mystery.
Your opinion? Do you think we'll find the plane?
I got to think at some point we'll find it. But if you notice, the Navy, I think they left the area in the Indian Ocean where they were searching. Maybe that means that we have intelligence telling us that maybe it went in a different direction. Maybe they think now it went towards land. I'm not sure. But I think at some point somebody will find something. But it may not be next week or even next year.
A year ago when you were with us, we discussed the nation's crumbling infrastructure. Here we are a year later, and Florida desperately needs road money. And there's a big argument as to where it's going to come from. Counties are broke, cities don't have it. There's not enough gas tax money to repair roads. Will there, in your judgment, be, and I know you don't like national programs, will there have to be some sort of funding mechanism for the repairing of the nation's infrastructure, which is falling into great disrepair?
Well, we actually, the gas tax, it may not provide enough revenue to do what everyone in Washington wants because they're talking about, they use it for high-speed rail and other stuff, but in terms of roads, you actually could do it. So what I'm on a bill to say, look, when you send money to Washington, it's almost like a black hole. People fight over it. A lot of it gets wasted on bureaucracy. So in Florida, we have way more gas taxes paid in than money we get out in terms of our infrastructure. So what I and a number of my colleagues would like to do is let's just transition that gas tax away from the federal government and let it go directly to states and localities. And then this way, I think people would be much more invested. I think the decisions that would be made would be much better. In Washington, a lot of it is just about who has more power. So, you know, Reid is going to get this, and Pelosi and Boehner or whatever. And I don't think having 435 members of Congress fight over this, if it goes to the state of Florida or some of it goes to the local governments, I think the dollars would go much further. And in Florida, we'd actually have more dollars because we wouldn't be sending a lot of that to Washington in the first place. And so devolve some of this stuff to the states and localities, because we have an interstate system. There are certain things that are truly interstate national priorities, but if you need to fix a county road or create build a bridge somewhere, a lot of that is more local in nature, and so let the local people control it. So I support infrastructure development. I think it's important, but I cannot, people say, oh, well, some people in Washington, well, we need to just raise the gas tax. Is there anybody here who's excited about sending more money to Washington? Do you think you're going to get a good bang for your buck on that? And I think most people, even who like the infrastructure, would much rather keep that money locally. And guess what? You have way more control in terms of holding your local officials accountable over what happens with the money, or even holding your state officials accountable. Congress is a morass, and the federal government bureaucracy can be a morass, and let's just more power locally. The money's there. It wouldn't require any new taxes. It would just be a devolution and a shifting.
Let me come to Homeland Security to ask you. It is troubling when we read these reports about maybe how vulnerable we may be. Our water supply, our electricity. There was an incident in California in which 9 transformers were taken out by a bunch of people they still haven't arrested. Fox News 2 Saturdays ago did a program on this about the EMP. We've talked about that, you and I, sir. How vulnerable are we, do you think?
Well, it is a vulnerability. And so I'm on 2 bills that basically are trying to force the federal government to close these vulnerabilities. Both of them are authored by Trent Franks from Arizona. So I think it's an issue that, if from a terrorist perspective, taking an airplane, blowing up people, doing some of this stuff, that is something that a lot of terrorists would want to do. But if you're attacking an EMP attack, attacking the electrical grid, or something in that nature, you can actually cause a lot more chaos if you do that successfully. And so basically, these bills are measures to force the federal government to take this on and develop some more defensive capabilities. So I do think it's an important issue, and that's one of the reasons why I've signed on to legislation that could be helpful.
This isn't on everybody's radar, but it's on a few people's radar. The nation's food supply, and specifically I'm addressing GMOs, genetically modified foods. A person who I know wanted to have the answer to that question received you this afternoon.
That's right.
At his health food store. Mitch Booth is in our audience tonight. Has stores in Ormond Beach and Port Orange. There's a growing number of people who feel that we may be killing ourselves by allowing these mechanisms to find their way into our food supply. Do you buy into that, or do you think that it's scare stuff? Are you worried about it?
Well, it's not something that I think it's scare stuff. I mean, I think people believe it's harmful, and then there are other people who don't think the science is there. So what I said today is I'm going to look at the information I've been provided and try to educate myself as best as possible on the science behind it.
Have any of your colleagues expressed any concerns over this?
It has not been an issue that has gotten on the congressional radar that I've seen in terms of, we did a big farm bill. I don't think the issue was ever broached in terms of amendments or anything like that. And we've done some other things that could be generally related to it. And we haven't seen legislation put on the House floor yet. So there may be some people who are working on things, but it's not been anything that I've seen be put on the front burner.
Okay, immigration reform. A year ago, you said such a bill was dead on arrival in the House, and the Speaker had said that. Your colleague, Congressman Lou Barletta of Pennsylvania, was here a few months later and said the same thing. We hear that bill, maybe there are forces in play that want to make this all about politics, that there's no real solution. Your thoughts? Is there a legitimate solution to the nation's illegal immigration problem?
So with the Senate bill, it's interesting. It gets back to the president picking and choosing which laws to enforce. Because if you look at that Senate bill, they would say, oh man, we got all this tough border security, you gotta pay a fine, do all this. But then you actually read it, and all that can be waived, lawfully waived. So none of it really needed to even be enforced. And of course, there may be provisions that the president wouldn't enforce. So I think the more people looked at that, that's the reason why it died very quickly, because it was basically repeating the 1986 Reagan amnesty all over again. And my view is the arguments that were made in that bill. And look, if I would have been in Congress at the time and Reagan came to me and said, look, we're going to get this security in place, we just got to do this, never again kind of deal, I may have been willing to go along with that. But as we've seen, none of that stuff was actually put into place. And so you've actually, the problem's now worse as a result of that bill. And so at the end of the day, when I see this basically just being rehashed, that's just not something that I'm interested in signing on to. Then I think also, so the illegal immigration is obviously an issue. And then in terms of what kind of legal immigration system do you want? My view is that it should be merit-based. I think we need to get away from this chain migration where people are bringing in their cousins or whatever. I mean, let's focus on people that have skills to offer, our society. And let's just be cognizant of the Senate bill was a huge increase in low-skilled immigration. The problem is we got a lot of blue-collar folks who haven't seen increases in their wages in a long time. And it's just basic economics. If you increase the supply, the price and the demand is constant, then the price is going to go down. And so when the Congressional Budget Office looked at it, they said that it would decrease wages for blue-collar U.S. citizens across demographics, white, African American, and Hispanic U.S. citizens. And so I think the high-skilled immigration reform would be pro-growth because we're fighting for all this other talent. But we also got to recognize that we got a lot of blue-collar folks who we need to put them back to work before we worry about illegal immigrants getting jobs or anything like that. Staying with unemployment, new statistics in the last week indicate the nation's unemployment rate is dropping slightly. Florida is ahead of the nation, dropping another 2 percentage points down to 6.1%. What do you attribute this to? Well, the national unemployment rate, the main reason why it's declined is because people have dropped out of the workforce. If you look at how population has grown over the last 5 years versus the number of jobs created, we basically haven't gained any ground once you consider the changes in population. So in other words, there have been jobs added, but not enough to keep up with the population increases, and that's a problem. The workforce participation rate is at its lowest level since the 1970s. One of the big knocks that people were using against Obamacare recently was the Congressional Budget Office came out and they said that Obamacare, because of the subsidy structure, would create a disincentive to work, so people would actually work less or not at all in order to maximize their subsidy. So it's a decline in workforce participation. And to me, that's a problem. I mean, if the same people who were looking for work 5 years ago, the same percentage, were doing so today and hadn't completely dropped out of the workforce, we would have unemployment be about 12% nationally. And it would be a little lower in Florida, and I think Florida has done some good things. But that's troubling because those are people who've been so discouraged that they're not even in the game anymore. And at some point, I think we got to get serious about trying to foster economic growth in this country, and that involves a number of things. But for example, it's frustrating to see given this economic situation, the president refused to approve the Keystone XL pipeline. His own State Department looked at that. They said environmentally it would be fine. They said that between direct, indirect, and induced jobs, you'd be looking at about 40,000 folks that could be put to work. And obviously, just from a security perspective, I think it would be better. So we've missed a lot of opportunities, and that's why it's been frustrating. Okay. Weather and climate are fields of study here at Embry-Riddle, as you well know. We've done a President Speakers event on that. I want to get your reaction for our audience here. Last week, your colleagues in the Senate did an all-nighter talking about climate change.
What was that all about? And sitting on the House side, what were you thinking?
Well, I can tell you what it was about. There's a couple very wealthy hedge fund billionaires in San Francisco who have pledged a lot of money for Democratic candidates who are willing to advocate cap and trade and carbon tax and some of these things. So they have no intention of actually offering that right now because they know it wouldn't be popular. But it was basically an opportunity to show some of these donor types that they're kind of in the fight. And so in that sense, I think for Harry Reid to let the Senate be used for that for such a crass reason, given the amount of money that's at stake, I thought was strange.
It might be interesting to tell us what you think of climate change. Very controversial, complex topic. How much do you believe?
It's not a question of my belief. When Al Gore speaks, as a member of Congress, I say, okay, Al, I'll assume everything you say is going to be true. Even though a lot of these predictions haven't been proven to be true that have already been made that we can evaluate, but nevertheless, I'll assume all that's going to be true. What are you telling us to do? And the answer is basically raise taxes. And so what that will do is that will create a huge amount of economic pain. It'll hurt low and middle income people disproportionately. And what will the result be? Nobody has seriously argued that it would save the planet or we'd have no more problems. Nobody's argued that. So you're talking about, you're basically going to have a minute change at best in your emissions for a huge cost. And the most effective vehicle that's been used lately has not been taxes or government regulation. It's been the shale gas boom and the technologies that have been developed. Our emissions have gone down, and that's the #1 factor because, yes, the natural gas is a fossil fuel, but it's much cleaner than coal. So people are moving to coal to natural gas. So my view is, from a policy perspective, those are not policies that I'm going to embrace, but I do think if we allow the private sector to work, if we allow innovation to take hold, you're going to see more things like with the gas revolution, and so you will end up having reduced emissions. And so a lot of the solutions, quote unquote, I've seen, I think would probably be counterproductive.
Sticking with energy here, there's two areas, and then we're going to go to the audience. We're finding a windfall for the North Dakota area and other areas of the country where we're finding we can drill for our own oil. Combine that with fracking, these two issues. Isn't that a major, major influence in the recovery of this nation if we can get the Keystone Pipeline bill signed?
There's no doubt. If you look, North Dakota no longer has an unemployment rate for all intents and purposes. People who want to go and work at McDonald's can get a signing bonus to sign up to work in McDonald's in North Dakota. You have blue-collar workers who are making $100,000 a year in North Dakota. And you're also seeing it with the Marcellus Shale in places like Ohio and Pennsylvania. And it's an interesting contrast because Ohio and Pennsylvania has embraced this. What has New York State done? Because the western part of New York State, which is a very economically depressed area, they would be able to utilize this, probably put a lot of people back to work. But in New York, you've had a lot of Hollywood actors and actresses protesting this, saying it's bad. And so the New York government has said, no dice here. So those folks are in the same boat that they were before this. And so it's a huge contrast. See places like Youngstown, Ohio starting to come back to life. I mean, that place was depressed for a long time. So I think that this is a huge part of a big economic recovery if we're willing to embrace it. And incidentally, the House has passed a number of bills to harness this and take advantage of this for our national interest. It puts people back to work. It gives us more supply here rather than the Middle East. And ultimately, we need this stuff to power our way of life. The idea that you're not going to use any fossil fuels anytime soon, it's just not economically feasible.
Unmanned systems. We did a President Speaker's event on unmanned systems. Most people focus on drones. An astonishing story in Washington yesterday. The Washington Nationals decided to use drones to take pictures of the people in the stands, and they were bragging about it. Help us understand, where's the policy on drone usage going to be in this country? I was hearing the feds were saying no. They were, even in Florida, the legislature was saying no limits on it. Where are we going with this?
Well, so a lot of that in terms of how states do it will be a determination for them. But I think that you can't use a drone to get around the Fourth Amendment. In other words, just because the technology will allow you to essentially conduct searches on people in their private residences, that doesn't mean that somehow you can overcome the Fourth Amendment on that. And so I would not allow drones to basically infiltrate your privacy and collect evidence against you to be used against you in court. Now, I do think militarily we should use drones for our military operations. They're effective both offensively, but also just in terms of the amount of clarity that they can provide folks who are monitoring operations. And so in that sense, so sometimes the drones kind of get lumped in as Eric Holder was asked, obviously before Rand Paul's filibuster, could you use a drone to shoot an American citizen sitting in a cafe? And Holder basically bumbled the answer. And so Paul launched his filibuster. And I think the answer to the question is if you're a U.S. citizen sitting at a cafe in Omaha, Nebraska, and you're suspected of something, and there's probable cause you could be arrested, they're not going to be able to shoot you with a drone. That would basically be an unconstitutional seizure. So I don't know why he couldn't answer that directly, but I think that has created a lot of fear among some people that does the government really think that they can just willy-nilly do these? I think he just made a mistake, but nevertheless, that was his mistake.
We're going to come to the audience now and your questions for Congressman DeSantis. Aubrey Curlin, one of our students here in Embry-Riddle, just raise your hand. She'll come right to you. If you can ask your question briefly, and then the congressman will answer, and then we'll move on to the next person. We'll try to get as many voices in as possible. Good evening. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Yeah, Congressman, I'd like to get your support. And I sent an email today with Hal Rogers on blocking Zohydro. I'm a pharmacist. We got a terrible condition with this thing, and now they're going to put this 50 milligram hydrocodone, which is more addictive than OxyContin. So I would really appreciate if you would maybe sign on to that legislation to do that. It would mean a lot to the people. And by the way, just for your information, Ms. Hamburg was here in Orlando last year and said she was going to block Zohydrin. Her legislative committee voted 14-3 to prevent letting the drug go through. She overrode them and allowed it to go through. 50 milligrams of hydrocodone.
Great. I appreciate you writing in. I'll definitely take a look. I wasn't familiar with exactly the details, but I'll take a look at it for sure. So thank you for bringing that to our attention.
Nick Cluting is on this side, and he has a question for Congressman DeSantis.
Is that me?
Yes, it's you.
Okay, thanks.
Since you have the microphone, ma'am,
I didn't know my name was Nick. I'm sorry. Can you tell me if the voter ID card issue would be settled by the midterm?
The voter
elections?
ID card issue?
Yeah, the mandatory voter IDs.
So in Florida you're talking about? Well, a lot of that's going to depend on what states do, whether they require photo ID or not. Supreme Court has looked at that. They said that it's a legitimate thing that can be used for elections. So I've always done the photo ID whenever I've voted and never had a problem with it. But in terms of how different legislatures are going to, whether they're going to put it in place or not, I'm just not sure what all the states are doing.
Right over here, your question for Congressman DeSantis, right into the microphone.
Congressman, this week we learned that the United States is going to give up whatever control it has over the internet. I'm deeply concerned about this. I wonder where you stand, and I wonder if we could possibly reverse this decision by the Obama administration with some upheaval from the grassroots.
Well, I definitely don't support yielding control of the internet to other governments or the UN or any of that for sure. I'm actually not sure about the details of what they're proposing. The news media has reported it, but they haven't actually put out what they're going to do. So I don't know if it's something that they want to send it to the UN or what, but clearly I'm not going to be supportive of anything that's going to jeopardize the freedom of the internet.
Over here, your question.
Congressman, a couple months ago we had the COLA reduction that went into effect, and all the congressmen, senators, congresswomen were upset with this and all spoke out, said we shouldn't take away benefits that were earned by our veterans And within 2 months, the repeal was put in place, money was offset, and everything. My question is, there's about 100,000 retired veterans that are disabled that have been waiting for 10 years to have our retirement returned to us instead of actually forfeiting it every month. And Congress every time says we don't have the money. Now clearly they could find the money for the COLA reduction repeal within 2 months, but in 10 years, the retirement for the disabled veterans hasn't been found, but yet everyone says we shouldn't be taking away the benefits from those veterans. So I'm curious why it's been taking so long and why no action is being taken by anybody.
Well, just in terms of the politics, I think that the putting in place the COLA reduction was something that they didn't really recognize the potency of that when they were doing it. In terms of the amount of money for that, I mean, it was only like $6 billion over 10 years, which in Washington speak is not a lot at all. But the problem was they basically were busting spending caps, and then they were saying, look, we're being responsible, and the only people who were targeted for that were 20-year veterans. So these are folks who've served 20 years of active duty. They retire, they draw immediately. So like I was active duty for 5 years, a little under 5 years, and then have been reserved since. So if I make it to 20, I won't draw right at 20. I'd wait till I'm 62. So really hit the folks who gave the most for that. And so when that happened, you know, I remember saying, I was like, this isn't going to fly. And some of my colleagues, and I voted no on it. Some of my colleagues voted for it. They're like, well, you know, we got to start somewhere. And I said, no, actually, if you're going to start somewhere, I think the 20-year veterans are the last place that we should start. Because of any benefit that's paid out, they've done the most to earn what they're getting. And especially when you look at people who are going to be retiring soon, 2016 is when it was supposed to go into effect. You have somebody in the Marine Corps from 96 to 2016. That individual retires as a gunnery sergeant or something. They may have done 4 or 5 tours in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And so they're the only people in the entire government or the entire amount of spending that this government does that's going to see a reduction as a result of this bill. So I just think it didn't sit well with people. So in terms of I think there's a bill that I'm supportive of. I think addresses that, but I think they're just different because this has been an issue that's been out there for a long time. It wasn't something that was recently changed, and so it's just the type of deal where it's got to get momentum to be able to be brought to the floor. But it'd be something that I would support, you know, and if it was there.
All right.
Up in the back now, your question for Congressman DeSantis.
Good evening, Congressman. I'm with my family here, but our loved ones are back in Venezuela, and that's the reason for this sign. We would like to know your opinion and your position. If you're going to support any effort in the Congress to support the Venezuelan people.
I'm 100% behind the Venezuelan people. They are being oppressed by the Maduro regime and by the Castro brothers who are sending forces in there. I think those people who are speaking out are brave, and I think that they are fighting for freedom and the ability to express themselves. And I think those folks who are willing to do that are natural allies of the United States. So I've already signed on to a number of different measures in Congress doing, you know, there's not, I mean, you know, I wish we could just solve it overnight, but just so we're lending our support to those people. So I'm behind you and those folks 100%.
I want to stay with this just to ask you, did the State Department take its eye off the ball on Central and South America the last few years? Because this seemingly popped up out of nowhere.
Well, basically the Obama administration came in and they wanted to have better relations with countries like Venezuela, like Argentina, you know, some of the places where there are anti-American leaders. And I think that sometimes when you're trying to be friendly with those types of regimes, they're not like me and you. Like if I give you a hand, you want to reciprocate, they'll construe that as weakness and say, well, we don't have to worry about the U.S. And so I think that a lot of those leaders have been emboldened over the last several years, unfortunately. But we also, you know, even before this administration, I think could have been doing more to be standing with the freedom fighters in that region. We have a lot of shared heritage with those countries, but there is a kind of strain of leftism that's gotten into power in places like Argentina, and places like Venezuela, places like Nicaragua that is hostile to U.S. interest, obviously, and hostile to the interest of the people those regimes purportedly represent.
We're going to go here. Then, Aubrey, you have someone there, and then if you can come down and get this gentleman in the third row so we can go back and forth. Nick is back over here. You have a question for Congressman DeSantis. Good evening.
Sir, thank you for coming tonight. It roughly costs yourself $1 million to seek election, $4 million in the Senate. So my question to you is, what is your opinion, due to the cost to seek election, you're forced to seek monies from special interest groups? Thus, by the time you get to Washington, your positions are now set in stone, and you can no longer reason or compromise.
I don't think that that's true at all, that my positions are set in stone. My policy was, if you want to give money to me, I'll take any lawful donations, because some people say, oh, well, I won't take from this group or this group. And I'm like, well, wait a minute, if that's what you're doing, then you're basically saying the people you will take for, that somehow you owe them. My view is, I don't owe anybody anything. They're buying into me, or they're supporting me because they think I'm going to do a good job. But there have been all kind of instances in which people have supported me and then have been disappointed with some of the positions I've taken. For example, the internet sales tax. Huge support for an internet sales tax on K Street and other places of Washington. And so, I had people, after I got elected, from some of those big industries support me in one way or another. And then I came out against the internet sales tax, and they weren't happy with me. But at the end of the day, you got to call them as you see them. In terms of $4 million for Senate races, you better update that this year. It's going to probably cost a lot more for people to run for the U.S. Senate. But I think part of the problem is that you have all these limits, so you're causing members to raise a lot of money from a lot of different interests, whereas if you just disclosed everything, if you have 2 or 3 main funding sources, then you could evaluate that and say, okay, that candidate is supported by some billionaire in San Francisco who wants cap and trade. This guy's supported by this guy in Vegas who has casinos. And I think it would be actually more transparent. Right now, because of the way the limits work, all these members, they spend so much time raising money. And $1 million even for a House race, yeah, in a non-competitive district that skews more to one party. But the one with Alex Sink and Jolly, there were probably, and it wasn't all that they raised it, but there were groups. It was like $8 million, I think, that was spent on that. And so my view is just be transparent about it, disclose everything, and then let voters make their determinations.
Before I take this question here, to stay with that, you were against the internet sales tax, said so here. You said so at the Lincoln Day dinners you spoke at. You even explained it. But there were a lot of people in the audience who supported you. Did you lose any of that support as you come up for re-election, do you think?
No, I think most people say, I appreciate what you're doing. I disagree with you on that. But that's not a lot of people. But here's the deal with that issue, just real quick. If I have a store that, and I don't do any internet sales, just people come in, I ring it up, I charge Florida tax, that's it. It doesn't matter if you're from Florida, Georgia, Maine, California, I'm collecting for Florida. If Mark has a store where he's selling over the internet, right now if somebody in California buys, he ships, he doesn't have to charge California tax. So this bill, Marketplace Fairness, would force him to collect and remit sales tax for California and all these other states, depending on where the customers were, which means he would be subjected to audits in all of those states. So there would be 45, 46 different potential tax audits, and so it's creating unfairness in the other direction because I don't have to card you and then pay any, I have no relationship with the California government. Even though just by him sending over a package into California, all of a sudden now he has to abide by all the California tax laws and regulations. So it would create a huge burden for kind of up-and-coming internet companies. And so I think ultimately the Senate passed that, and it's basically died in the House. And I think that's part of the reason why. Why would I want somebody here just by shipping a good somewhere like that, for them to have to get audited by Illinois, California, and New York, it would be way too complex and burdensome.
In the audience, your question now.
Thank you, Congressman. I just want to say a heartfelt thanks that you came and spent time not only at my store but with members of the community. As a businessman who's committed to the environment, you mentioned the decision in New York to prevent fracking. Water is the single most important entity that everyone in this room shares. You don't believe that there's good science that indicates that perhaps the fracking might be serious enough to at least investigate further as a reason why New York might have held up on this?
Well, but I don't think that there might be a reason to investigate is the same as there being a scientifically substantiated evidence of harm. I mean, I think that's a pretty big gulf. There are a lot of things that could potentially, you could create theories, but I don't think it's been demonstrated that the potential problems that you articulated are in fact a result. They could be, but I think most people who've looked at it have said otherwise, and so I think that's where what I've seen has been pretty consistent.
And you certainly understand that water is going to be the issue in the future, not carbon fuels.
Well, look, we've done a number of water bills to try to assist that in Congress, and so I'm all for that. I mean, California is going through a huge amount of problems right now, and so we're trying to work with them.
And they're dealing with single elements like chromium, fluoride, and we won't even talk about pesticides and herbicides. Obviously, my business is dependent on access to fruits and vegetables that aren't contaminated. It's a serious issue. I've got one other question.
But I need to move on. I can come back to you if we have time, because I've got to try to get other voices in. Good evening. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Hi. As a baby boomer and a former reader of 1984, I've read a lot about, I want to know if it's true, about Homeland Security buying all that ammunition and closing the plants that make the bullets. I think it's the iron or whatever. Lead, yes, thank you. Is that true, and what do you think?
So we had a lot of people contacting us about this, multiple members of Congress. So on the Oversight Committee, we actually did a hearing about the ammo purchases. We brought Homeland Security in. We asked them all these questions. And basically, they said that the amount that they've purchased is consistent with their training mission. And they pointed to Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, Georgia. They pointed to some other areas. So we weren't able to substantiate in a very significant way that this was being done to try to affect the availability of ammunition. In fact, they under oath flatly denied that under multiple questions. And so, I can't tell you that for sure none of that's happening, but we have not been able to substantiate it in Congress at this time.
I think we're due to go on this side. Aubrey, if there's anybody over on this side, we'll come over to you. Nick, if you can get a person over here. Aubrey, why don't you grab this folks right here, and we'll get our next question for the Congressman.
Thank you. Congressman, I had an interesting visit to the CVS pharmacy here last week to pick up a prescription. And what I saw, a couple of people ahead of me was a pretty well-known businessman. I live in DeLand, and he's also in DeLand, to pick up a prescription. And the pharmacist said, I need to see an ID before he would release the prescriptions to him. So he pulled out his driver's license and credit card and so on and so forth. Okay, I said all that to say this. I am so fed up, so sick and tired with the Democrats' bleeding hearts concerning all the people here in this country, obviously all Democrats, that are being summarily punished, if you will, because the fact that people are putting pressure on them for voter IDs, cards, and people like Chuck Schumer and others say it would be such a tremendous hardship for these people to be able to get voter ID cards. Well, let me make a suggestion for you to maybe convince your people on the constituents on the other side of the aisle. If they feel that bad about these people, obviously their local their senators and congressmen have a pretty good idea who these people are, where they live. Why don't they furnish them with transportation so they can pick them up, take them down to the voter registration offices so that they can become legal and carry IDs like the rest of us?
Obviously, frustrated voter, and you're hearing this a lot.
It's interesting. There was a news item where there was some liberal group that did an anti-voter ID protest, but in order to check in with the protest organizers, you had to show a photo ID. So I think it's a bad argument. And you look at polls, Democrats overwhelmingly support voter IDs. People try to say, oh, it disadvantages, this racial group or this ethnic group. Across all groups, there's support for a voter ID. And so sometimes when I hear that that's going to be a burden, I think that that's really not thinking very much of some of our fellow citizens. And I believe all these folks have the competence to go get an ID, and I think almost all of them do as it is right now. And so I think it's kind of a red herring used to try to create conflict in our politics.
With precious minutes left here, I've been waiting for somebody to ask this question, and it hasn't come up yet, so I'll ask it. I know it's early, but do you see one or two names that are starting to emerge that might be people that you like to run for president in 2016?
I'm not seeing anyone now because I think until we get through the midterms, it's just premature. But I think what you'll see is you'll see a number of governors, people perhaps like Scott Walker from Wisconsin, Chris Christie, John Kasich from Ohio. You'll see senators like Rand Paul from Kentucky, perhaps Marco Rubio from our state here. And I think a lot of it will depend on what the political environment looks like after the 2014 elections. And so we shall see. But I think the field's going to be a lot stronger this time than it was in 2012.
I think a lot of people have buyer's remorse over Mitt Romney, that they didn't vote for him?
People say if you could do it again, more Obama voters would do different than Romney voters. But sometimes that's just, look, I mean, Romney, I think, missed some opportunities. I was at the Republican convention in 2012, and if you'll recall, that was just after President Obama made some comments saying, look, you guys have a business. You didn't build that. Somebody else made that happen. And it was an outrageous comment in the sense that we have so many people in this country who've risked everything to start something, blood, toil, tears, and sweat. And for him to just say somebody else did that, I can understand why that really struck a chord with a lot of entrepreneurial types. The problem is when that's the whole theme of your convention, we built that, we did this, you got to understand, you're not talking to 90% of the country at that point, because most folks, they want to do better in their own profession, they want to advance in the company they're working for, whatever. They're not necessarily going to start their own business. So I think being pro-entrepreneur, absolutely, you got to do it, but I think voters saw him as only talking to other executives and not talking to blue-collar workers or things like that. And so I think we miss an opportunity, and I think people are starting to understand that and try to speak to a more broader segment of the population and not just say that all we care about are people who are starting businesses. Yes, that's vitally important, but I want to have people who can serve in those businesses and increase their take-home pay and advance in that company in addition to those who are running the company.
Okay, Mitt Romney and Sarah Palin said Russia was the next serious challenge to the United States Homeland Security. Secretary Kerry said climate change. Who's closer to the truth?
Well, I mean, look, we can deal militarily, diplomatically with geopolitical threats and in the form of other countries. The idea that we have the capacity to change or to stop the climate. I mean, I'm just skeptical. We can't even build shovel-ready projects a lot of times. I mean, it's just, it has a different view of government, but it was true that Romney said Russia was a geopolitical foe, and I think if you look at that third debate, President Obama was just ridiculing him. Oh, how could you say that? You're saying the Navy, we used to have bayonets and all this stuff. And I think that, look, rewinding that tape, it does not make the president come off very well.
Up in the middle, your question, ma'am.
Yes, I'm a retired state employee, and my question is, before the Goff spill, assets for food stamps were counted, so they couldn't get food stamps. Now no assets are counted. People have $181,000 in a 401k, and they qualify for food stamps. When are you going to go back to the assets start counting again?
Well, we actually tried to do that. So there were, so food stamp use has quadrupled in the last 12 years, and it's doubled since the president has taken over. Now, part of that is we've had a bad economy, so there's a natural increase. But even as the economy's gotten a little better, still going up. So what we said in the House was, all right, if you don't meet the income requirements and you have more or you're earning more, or you have these, then you shouldn't be getting food stamps. It should be for people who are in tough situations. And then the other thing we wanted to do was say, because people say, oh, well, if you want to stop paying so much in food stamps, you want to hurt these children. We said, no. If you're a mother with children, that's fine. But if you're a single adult with no dependents at all, then if you're getting food stamps, you need to either work, look for work, do job training, but you can't just keep getting it infinitum and not be willing to at least try. So those were the two main things that we tried to do. And this is why it's frustrating, because I've said, I respect a lot of my Democratic colleagues, but when I go out there and I hear these Democrats saying those two reforms, when we're trying to take food out of the hands of children, it's demagoguery. And they can't defend those things. And so all those reforms got voted out of the Farm Bill. The Senate wouldn't accept any of them. We managed to try to change, there's this heat and eat provision, so that if you're above the income requirements, if any state gave you just $1 in heating assistance, you automatically became qualified for food stamps. So we said we can't do that. So we raised it to at least, well, I didn't do because I didn't vote for the Farm Bill, but they raised it to $20, thinking that may cut down on fraud. So now what New York and some of these states are doing is they're now devoting more money to the heat and eat so that they can get around the income limitations. And so, look, a safety net is for the folks who, through no fault of their own, need it. It shouldn't be used for people who can try to take advantage of the system. And that's all we're trying to do with some of these reforms, but there just wasn't enough support in the Senate to advance them through.
Question on the left side.
Thank you, Congressman. I'd like to ask you about a question about Article 5 convention. And I bring this up because even though I know you don't feel influenced by K Street lobbyists, and even if none of your colleagues in the House or Senate are influenced by the K Street lobbyists, that's not how the American public feel.
Well, I never said none of my colleagues are.
Correct. But I'm saying regardless of whether or not they are influenced, the American people have lost confidence in the system. And so if enough of a grassroots movement convinces a sufficient number of states to petition Congress for an Article 5 convention, then there will be one, because the Constitution mandates that. If that were in fact the case, what amendments would you like to see that Constitutional Convention propose?
Term limits for members of Congress. A balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. And then an amendment I've proposed to force Congress to live under the same laws that they pass on other people. I think if you did those, there are other things you could do. I think the president should have a line item veto so that he can veto out pork projects from appropriation bills. That'll save the taxpayers money. And so there are other things you can do, but I think those three things would be a very good start. And so something like term limits, that's been probably the biggest frustration of mine, because Congress is not going to term limit themselves. So I've tried to figure out ways, could we maybe just do an amendment that lets the states determine whether they want term limits, this or that, but it's hard to get enough people there. But that's something, if the states could just decide it, that would happen in a New York minute. You'd see term limits, because 90% of the public supports term limits. And so I think that those would be good reforms. But that is why they had Article 5, because some of the changes that need to be made have to be made against the wishes of the ruling class in Washington, and they knew that if you always had to depend on Congress getting 2/3 to make the changes, then you'd be out of luck. So they wanted a mechanism where you could go around Congress and impose those reforms. Let me just say one thing. It's just kind of, and I don't know if you wanted to cover it, but an issue that comes up a lot for me, hasn't come up tonight, is this issue of the IRS. So I think it may be worth it just to kind of, I'm on the House Oversight Government Reform Committee, and kind of where we stand with that. When IRS admitted the misconduct, a lot of people, a lot of my Republican friends are like, ooh, Obama ordered that or whatever. And basically, that's not what happened. But I think what happened is actually more concerning from the standpoint of the long-term viability of our system. What you would have is, yes, the president in the State of the Union would complain about different conservative groups. Chuck Schumer, Durbin on the Senate floor, basically saying, the IRS needs to do something. And so what would happen is people like Lois Lerner and the bureaucracy, they didn't have to be ordered to do it. She was hearing what people wanted her to do, and she was all too willing to target conservative groups. And we have emails for her where she's saying these groups are dangerous, where she's saying things like, ooh, we got to make sure that the Democrats keep the Senate and all this stuff. And so this is a partisan bureaucrat who's using her immense power with the taxing authority of our government to essentially target the groups that she disagrees with. And so to me, that raises profound implications, especially given the fact that we have such a huge bureaucracy. I mean, are there Lois Lerners in other agencies of government that we don't know about right now? It's a scary thought. So she came to the Oversight Committee last year and basically tried to pull a fast one. So when I was a prosecutor, I would look at the defendant, I'd wonder, is he going to testify or not? The minute he got up there to put his butt in the stands or in the chair to testify, I was licking my chops. Why? Because I knew I'd be able to cross-examine him. What a criminal defendant can't do is go up there, proclaim their innocence, tell their side of the story, then get to sit back down without being cross-examined. Well, Lerner basically tried to do that. She came in, she swore an oath, she made essentially 17 different factual statements, all exculpatory statements exonerating herself, and then she invoked the Fifth Amendment so she didn't have to answer questions from the committee. And oh, by the way, we've since found out, since that time where she invoked the Fifth, she's been interviewed by the Justice Department and been interviewed by the Inspector General for tax. So she's willing to talk to the agency that could potentially prosecute her, but she won't talk to the representatives of the American people. And I think the reason is because she knows the Department of Justice is not going to do anything for her. The fix is in on that investigation. The individual who's in charge of that is a max-out donor to the president's campaign. They haven't even interviewed the people who were targeted in that. And so the question is, what are we going to do about it now in Congress? We've already voted that she waived her Fifth Amendment right. She came back again to the committee recently and invoked her Fifth Amendment protection again. And so I think at this point, our committee will likely vote to hold her in contempt of Congress. We cannot force her to answer questions, but we can penalizing her for not answering questions after she told her side of the story. And so then that could go on to the full Congress. But here's the thing. If you're held in contempt of Congress, ultimately you need the Justice Department to enforce that. And I am not optimistic that Eric Holder is going to do that. And so that's just kind of where we are with that. But to me, it's very frustrating because if an elected president or an elected member of the Congress misbehaves, the voters have more of a defense. If you have somebody in that bureaucracy who's not elected or even appointed and confirmed by the Senate, and they're going to pursue use their power in a partisan way, that is very, very troubling, especially the taxing authority. And so to the extent that that's being transformed into an arm of the Democratic Party, it would be just as wrong if it was an arm of the Republican Party. That is not what you want the taxing authorities to be doing. Maybe that's why we need to move in a totally different direction with our tax system and not have the IRS have so much power in the first place.
The Justice Department not holding people accountable. Gee, who would think that happened? I've got time for a couple more. We're over here this time, and your question for Congressman DeSantis. Thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you. Congressman, I don't know whether you are aware that for the first time in 5 years, the congressional budget of January allocated $0 for UN peacekeepers. I don't think our troops want to go to Mali or South Sudan or Lebanon, but they don't have the resources to do what they need to do. How do you respond?
Well, those UN, they have not been effective, quite frankly, in terms of the missions. And so a lot of that money, has not been well spent. And I wasn't aware of it being zeroed out. I had not heard that. But the bottom line is, if you want something to get done, you go to the UN, you'll get a lot of talking, you'll get a lot of foot dragging. If you actually want something to get done, you got to do it yourself. America's got to do it. And so the idea that we're going to be ever putting our troops in that situation, although I know that we were in Korea, but that was when the UN was just starting, it's just not something that I think the American people want to see. And so I think that the UN time and time again has failed to rise to the challenge of dealing with some of these issues internationally, unfortunately.
Aubrey has our last question. I think it's up front here. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you. Congressman DeSantis, first I want to thank you for coming and speaking to all of us tonight. It's very refreshing to have a congressman who, one, speaks his mind and sticks to his convictions. My question is, I'm the president of the National Association of Postal Supervisors, covering pretty much your entire district. I represent supervisors, postmasters, managers in the Postal Service. The Postal Service is facing an unprecedented financial challenge right now with the pre-funding of future retiree health benefits to the tune of $5.5 billion a year, placing us in an untenable situation that occurred through the 2006 Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act. Congress has failed to rectify this. I was up in your office last week and spoke with your staff. Very professional, love your staff too, by the way. My question is, are you going to get on board with some of the reforms to fix the Postal Service's finances? And it affects everybody in this room. Elderly folks that get their medicines through the mail. We have the most efficient Postal Service on the planet. We affect $9 billion of commerce in this country. We need a viable Postal Service. Congressman Issa has a bill that is basically a train wreck. No other Republican is even supporting his bill. So what are your thought processes as far as reamortizing the pre-funding of future retiree benefits, giving the Postal Service some latitude as far as the services that we can offer? As you know,
well, what's the vehicle for doing that?
Yeah, there's a number of bills in the House. I provided all that information to your staff last week.
So in terms of the funding of health care, I mean, I understand I've had people at the post office say that to me, but what are the actual unfunded liabilities that exist with the health care? Isn't it $50 billion in unfunded liabilities?
In that ballpark, yes, sir. But what occurred in 2006 was that Congress passed legislation that the Postal Service would have to pre-fund that in a 10-year time frame. Well, it doesn't do any good when the Postal Service doesn't have the money. We've already defaulted in 3 years on those payments because we don't have $5.5 billion in excess to provide to the Department of the Treasury.
But I guess here's the issue, though, that you obviously know more about it than me. The use of the mail is declining because of email and stuff like that. I mean, that's just a reality. I know the Postal Service is trying to adapt to that, but if that's the case, if there are less volume and you have these unfunded liabilities, I mean, the bill is going to come due at some point, correct? So how are you going to ever be able to square that circle?
Well, what I'm saying is you don't jam $100 billion worth of liabilities into a 10-year period. There's $50 billion already pre-funded in the Postal Service's coffers for future retirees. Now, these aren't people that are already retired. These are people that are going to retire in the future, up to 70 years from now. Some of them haven't even been born yet.
In other words, because if I may, is there the prospect that there could be either a hearing or a new mechanism to answer some of these requirements that are made when the funding mechanism may not be present?
Well, there is a movement in the House, I know, to just do a general postal reform, and then there's a movement in the Senate to do that. But I don't think the House is going to do anything until we see if the Senate's able to even move on it. So that's, so I haven't gotten deep into the weeds on that just because it hasn't been something that people have said, we're going to be voting on soon.
I'll be happy to help you with the weed eater.
I want to thank you all. Marvelous questions tonight from all of you. I want to thank people who worked to make this happen tonight. Up in control, Richard Weekly came back to help us tonight, and both Nick and Aubrey helped with the people here in the audience. Sean Ward produced our program back at WNDB, and this will be at erau.edu at our website for the university. It will also be shown on YouTube and will be eventually on our Roku channel. I want to thank our host, Dr. John Johnson, who is with us tonight and joined us, Mrs. Johnson, Dr. Heist, and so good to see you again, Mrs. DeSantis. Thank you for coming here as well. Our next event comes up on April 14th. It's part of a two-day wonderful tribute to veterans. The President's Veterans Appreciation Day is April 15th, something that Dr. Johnson began, I believe, 6 years ago. The night before, a Navy SEAL will join us. He will also be our keynote speaker at the ceremony the next day on the 15th. You'll have a chance to meet Jason Redmond, a former Army Ranger and the author of the book, The Trident. And it will be right here in the Gail Lemron Auditorium in the Captain Willie Miller Building. It begins at 6 o'clock. The doors open at 6. The event starts at 7, free and open to the public. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, a round of applause for our guest, Congressman Ron DeSantis.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. Have a great night, everybody.
Thanks for having us.